Hello and welcome to this afternoon's debate. It's a hybrid conference by Euractiv, supported by Google. My name's Jennifer Baker. I'm going to be your moderator today, talking about the Digital Services Act. And we're going to be asking what the European Union's economy, the digital economy, is really going to look like after the DSA. We're going to talk about what we want it to look like, as well as all the negotiations that are entering, we believe, their final stage at this point. It's been a long road to get here. So we're going to talk about the key points. The DSA is one of the biggest overhauls of the digital rules in more than 2 decades. We've seen other elements relating to this that will interact with it, things like cybersecurity, things like the GDPR. There's a lot of different questions, a lot of different moving parts. So we also have to think about how the DSA interacts with those other laws and what it's going to mean in terms of enforcement, in terms of implementation. We're going to have a lot of discussion on that. I will remind the audience that you can enter your questions to our great panellists in the box just to the right of your screen. You can type your questions in there, please. If they're for a specific panellist, do say so, or if they're for the entire panel, indicate that as well, and I will try to get to as many as possible in the time we have. You can also share on social media using the hashtag EADebates. Now, I'm very pleased to have with me in our hybrid format, joining me in the room, we have Sandro Gozzi, MEP and member of the IMCO committee in the European Parliament. Joan Barata is Intermediary Liability Fellow on the programme on platform regulation at Stanford Cyber Policy Centre. Joining remotely, we also have Asha Allen, Advocacy Director for Europe in the online expression and civic space at the Centre for Democracy and Technology. And last but not least, also happily joining us in person again, Ziada El Ramli, Director General at .Europe. So thank you all very much for being here. Sandro, I'm going to let you open the discussion. Tell us why the DSA is so important, why you think now might be a turning point, and what the economy should look like afterwards. In brief, we'll delve into the details in due course.
It's important because after 2 centuries, it was big time to adopt new rules, because after all, in the time of digital revolution, 20 years are 2 centuries for the technological innovation and for digital transformation. And the last big piece of legislation that we adopted in Europe in this sector was the e-commerce directive of the beginning of this new millennium. So of course it was absolutely important. It's important because it is ambitious, in my view. There are some points on which I would have liked more. We can come back on that, but there is an ambition of the European Union to act as a global rule setter, global standard setter, and to develop a model which is alternative to the too laissez-faire, everything based on self-regulation, which is the US model, and a totally state-controlled model, undemocratic, with the Chinese. So, I mean, I think that we have the right ambition to propose not only to our consumer, our citizens, but to the rest of the world, if it works, a new approach to the digital issues. And the last, but certainly not least, because it's easy to say but difficult to implement, the principle what is illegal offline must be illegal online. But this is the main purpose, one of the main purposes of the Digital Services Act. These are 3 reasons why I think it's going to make a change also in the European economy, more choice for the consumer, more pluralism in the market, so more opportunities also for, new firm, new business, and more transparency for the existing business. So, this is all, in my view, good news for all of us.
Well, thank you. You mentioned this idea of exporting rules to the world, and I mentioned at the beginning the GDPR, which is seen as a template for how the EU can be a leader globally in terms of digital rules. John, let me bring you in. What is your perspective on this? And give me your opening overview on what you think we should be discussing when it comes to the DSA.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope that at least you can see me. Perhaps I'm frozen, but I'm sorry, you can hear my voice. Apologies. I'm in the Maldives, but for work, and this is why I have this connection that is not completely unstable, completely stable. Well, what I would like to say first of all is that indeed the world is looking, and this is why we need to be particularly careful when it comes to drafting the DSA, because we have already seen, for example, with the NetzDG, that some of the parts of that German law were kind of copied by authoritarian regimes, so to speak. So I think that it is very important to understand that now Europe is setting the tone of, let's say, international debates when it comes to platform regulation. That there are all the debates going on in other parts of the world, for example, in the United States, where Section 230 is being weakened more and more and more. We also have the competing model of the online safety bill in the United Kingdom that will also try to attract, let's say, the practices of platforms towards the orbit of the idea of online safety. A law, by the way, this British proposal, is based probably on the principle that what is freedom of expression offline can be harmful online, which is a very dangerous principle. That there are some chances that in certain ways it can be incorporated into the European model as well. But let me just make a final reflection, because we only have a few minutes. In order to build the market, we need legal certainty, and legal certainty is still to be achieved in the field of platform regulation, because we already have all the rules or the laws in Europe. We have terrorist content online regulation, we have the audiovisual media services directive, we have the copyright directive in a very voluntary, in a very, let's say, perhaps aspirational manner. Now there's an amendment to the DSA saying that the Commission will provide guidelines on how to deal with that big constellation of norms, but I think it can be particularly challenging. So I think that additional efforts still need to be made in order to make sure that by incorporating the DSA to this already existing network of rules, we don't damage legal certainty, we don't harm legal certainty, because this is a basic precondition, as I said, for building a prosper and predictable market, and therefore an attractive market. Thank you.
Thank you. Asha, let me bring you in. Joanne there talking about legal certainty and how that's needed for business side and platform economy side of things. Obviously, individuals want legal certainty as well in terms of defence of rights. Give me your opening thoughts around this area.
Yes, certainly, and very much to echo Joan there is certainly a need for legal clarity, of course, and I just want to thank you, of course, for the invitation to speak here today. And, you know, the achievement of the EU's digital single market has been on the docket for consecutive Commission terms. And whereas the DMA aims to improve the way digital markets work and indeed also need to be centered upon the protection of users' human rights, the DSA addresses concerns around user-generated content, which is subjectively much more complex endeavor, especially as it concerns issues of free expression, freedom from discrimination, and the balancing of fundamental rights, platform accountability, and the prevention of government surveillance and censorship. These are very deep issues with the need for a very nuanced conversation and debate. And so it is without doubt that the legislative framework in Europe has required a significant update for years. And I'm sure many of us have been in similar conversations about the Digital Services Act and the opportunity that it presents even before the draft was published at the end of 2020. So the need for legal clarity in our contemporary digital reality and the opportunity that it still presents to define a human rights-centric model of platform governance, even in these late stages of the negotiations, is still very apparent. So what the European digital ecosystem will look like, for me anyway, is a multidimensional question. On the one hand, if done correctly, the EU could set a precedent for the most comprehensive and holistic legislative framework for platform and content governance. And the two-pronged approach that we see in the Digital Services Act along how to appropriately tackle illegal content and the due diligence obligations need to be, of course, founded upon the preservation of fundamental rights, but more importantly, need to be practically implementable and enforceable. And in achieving this, we will create a harmonized approach, again, going back to what Joan was mentioning there, to the challenges the digital ecosystem has increasingly faced, particularly given the variations in approaches adopted in national legislation in this area. And on the other hand, the question also needs to look beyond the European scope. The DSA will be to our public discourse what the GDPR was to privacy. There's no doubt about this. It's going to be a game changer with far-reaching implications well beyond the European jurisdictions. So I would ask, how would the DSA shape the digital economy and the digital environment on a global scale? So from this fundamental rights perspective, we hope that the DSA does achieve its aim in reestablishing the rules for online intermediary services, being clear on their responsibilities, the responsibilities of public authorities as well, and will provide individuals and users with meaningful transparency and bring much needed clarity to the operationalization of the EU digital market and create a safer, more vibrant and diverse online space that's founded upon those EU values.
Thank you, Asha. Sayada, it falls to your opening remarks. You can draw a lot on what your fellow speakers have said, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you, Euractiv, for having me. Indeed, the DSA was much needed for everybody involved, for stakeholders, for the industry, for users at large, to better European regulation in the online service space. And I think that this Commission has been very clear on having a vision to create these fundamental framework pieces that would set the approach to these services. Something that the e-commerce directive did for a long time in a limited manner when it came to liability especially. But this is much broader. So the DSA is accompanied by the DMA, is accompanied by the AI Act, the Data Act, all these fundamental pieces that together will create that framework. And I think that if we look at it as part of the bigger puzzle, we're not there yet, first of all. And secondly, it is the whole approach of all of that on how to deal with online services, which is the right approach to take. The industry needs the legal certainty. Everybody else does as well. So there, I'm quite confident that we've been asking for it for a while as well. The other thing is, why aren't we there yet? Because I think we're very quick at now saying, well, it's almost done. We're in the last sprint to the finish. there's still so much to be done. Like, I don't envy the co-legislators in their negotiations how much they actually need to deal with right now. The fact that there are new concepts that have been introduced to the text as part of the considerations by the co-legislators that now have to be resolved and have to be addressed, but that there isn't a common approach on. Things that will be fundamental. How is the enforcement going to work? How are codes of conduct for very large online platforms going to interact with, and potential oversight bodies under those codes of conduct going to interact with DSCs, for example? Are the member states ready to put DSCs in place in the implementation time that we have? All those things still need to be figured out, but I do think to end on an optimistic note, I think it will set the scene again. And the whole package of all of these fundamental framework pieces will set Europe as a front runner in terms of exporting digital policy.
Well, in terms of enforcement, we've seen time and again that once the law is there, there is a grace period to allow member states to get their house in order. So let's perhaps give them the benefit of the doubt on that. But Sandro, as one of the co-legislators, I'll give you the opportunity. You said there's certain things you'd like to see changed or tweaked. Do you want to highlight those now before we get into discussions of how it might impact users?
Oh, I mean, I give you just an example, talking about user and illegal content. I would have wish to see not only a takedown but a stay down obligation. Once that you have identified an illegal content, you don't have as a consumer to be put at risk to meet that illegal content again. So I mean, that is only an example of something that I know that some platform didn't like it, but from the consumer protection perspective, we take a very important step ahead. But I think that there are few issues that in the review clause, I mean, we will review the implementation of the DSA, and that review clause, I get that this would be, just to give you one example, one of the issues that on which we will come back.
Asha, let me bring you in and ask you, what do you think will change for users down the line if we see the DSA as it currently stands?
Well, I think it's actually a very broad question. There are many things that could change for users, but as a first point, I would say that many central tenets of the free internet should fundamentally remain in place from the e-commerce directive, and this is vital, such as the conditional liability framework and the prohibition of general monitoring. It's essential that these are not undermined as the negotiations continue. But what will change and what will rightly change specifically for users, because I think it's important to understand that the DSA is going to impact many different actors through the entire chain, but specifically for users, there will be additional clarity provided on the processes and the mechanisms for content moderation, which at the moment still remains quite opaque for users generally. At the center of the Digital Services Act are extensive transparency obligations, which are applicable across various areas of the text. And this aspect of transparency is one that I wanted to zoom in on. The DSA is huge. I think those of us who've read it multiple times know how large it is. So I wanted to zoom in on one point there. And it's important because it's an essential cog in the mechanism when it comes to accountability. And so some examples of this include, say, increased transparency on terms of services, for example, so statements of reasons for content moderation decisions. They are important for providing users with a more predictable environment, as already mentioned, and know the possibilities and limits around their behavior online. But users will also be able to identify what content is an advertisement, for example, and should be provided with much more control over the functional mechanisms related to targeted advertising, which are incredibly useful. Another example of what may change will be increased access for users to an array of redress and dispute settlement mechanisms and how these can be assessed and making sure they're accessible to all. But these are just a few examples. The main takeaway here must be that users, if the DSA is done correctly, should see a fundamental paradigm shift, and that they should be empowered with a better understanding of the services that they use and more control over the parameters that they engage with, all under the umbrella in being a fundamental human rights based approach that is preserving their rights in these spaces. it's important that these preserved changes for users must contribute to improving the digital ecosystem for the better and work in practice. And this ties into what some speakers have already mentioned about enforcement and when the DSA will be implemented. So in short, there should be central tenets that are protected, and so users may be able to still experience a free internet, which is incredibly important, particularly for marginalized communities who use this for mobilization and awareness raising. But similarly, there should be increased control, increased transparency, and a safer environment as well.
Jean, let me bring you in as well to talk about this question of what it will mean to users and what can they rely on. I mean, will it be a seismic shift? And if we look a little bit broadly, how much future-proofing can be built into something like the DSA? Because we talk a lot about legal certainty, but there's a lot of shifts within the tech side of things as well that perhaps new developments may result in uncertainty when they're not sure how they can be applied to the DSA.
Yeah, sure. I totally agree with what has just been said. I think that this is a major step forward when it comes to protecting the rights of users, because so far most of the discussions in the area of platform regulation have been around this idea of intermediary liability, how intermediary liability is understood, how it is protected, the American model, the European model, and this is the first time that in a very consistent manner, I would say in a very articulated manner, a law, let's say, tackles this issue in a systematic way, in a coherent way, including many different rights and safeguards. Also, what I've seen is that in the process of amendments, many new rights, many new safeguards have been introduced, and they also, of course, represent new tasks for platforms. And here we also need to be able to assess whether, this huge amount of new tasks that now platforms will be facing, how this can be, this can be managed by them. Of course, there's always this assumption that, okay, platforms have the money, so they will have the capacity, they only need to invest. But to what extent the way, now content needs, the way content will be moderated, to what extent this is the best way to spend platforms' money and platforms' time. For example, the need to provide statements of reasons and then establish a database. There are certain obligations that perhaps, there are ways to make them a little bit more proportionate, not for the sake of, let's say, helping companies to save money, but just to avoid, the imposition of very cumbersome obligations in practice that they don't bring any specific benefits for users. And at some point, let's say, what these let's say obligations may create, let's say, market entry barriers that we don't want to impose in Europe, because what we want to do is to also facilitate the emergence of European platforms. So I think that this is an angle that also needs to be considered. And when it comes to the adaptation of to future challenges, it is obvious that the DSA, opens the door or to, let's say, to solve perhaps these issues via co-regulatory mechanisms or via self-regulation that are both then contemplated by the DSA itself. The problem here is that some of the, let's say, empowerments look a little bit too vague, and they do not contain perhaps sufficient safeguards in terms of the possible impact that these, let's say, forms of co-regulation, self-regulation may have on the right of users.
I will push back and say that often people think that self-regulation is no regulation, so we're going to come on to a little bit about enforcement. Ziada, how do you react to this question of it being overly burdensome, some of the elements being overly burdensome for business?
Some of the suggestions have been, I think, and that's exactly the point that we have made on how do we create clarity on what the added value is. So transparency is very broad and a very big topic. We're not against transparency. That's fine. But to whom and to what end and what kind of transparency is more the question that we usually ask. We're getting more clarity on that, I think, as discussions are going forward. And I think what we'll need to see as well is, will some of the obligations on very large online platforms eventually somehow impede growth of some of those who are just on the cusp? Because it's quite a suite in terms of risk mitigation measures that are foreseen. It's quite a suite of things that they need to do. And I don't know, there are some that are just around that threshold. How would that actually translate into those companies being able to respond to that? But with every piece of legislation, there are obligations that the companies will have to make do and work with. It's just that, for example, on some of the issues, on the obligations, we did need to have more clarity. We still need some more clarity on what does it mean in terms of some of the proactive measures we can take on disinformation, for example. And it is something that we're concerned of. MEP Gozi mentioned the stay-down obligations, for example, that didn't make it through to the final text in the European Parliament. But I think there's a valid reason why those kinds of debates have to be had, and that's because it would be in direct contradiction with the ban on general monitoring. And so how do you balance that out to come up with a sound piece of legislation at the end? And I think that's what's happening right now.
I mean, and do you think some of this has been amplified due to, if you like, mainstream current affairs? We see disinformation currently with the war in Ukraine as a huge issue that not just companies but users are very, very worried about, and they are asking for solutions from our policymakers. Do you feel that's driving the debate, or the DSA has been going so long that these are just add-ons?
I think tech policy is not left up to the geeks anymore. I think everybody has an opinion about it because it actually it impacts our daily lives. It's what we see in the news. It's how we use our services online. It's how we live our lives, especially coming out of a pandemic where a lot of our lives have been pushed online. That has kind of accentuated the pivotal role of some of the services. And so I think everybody has an opinion. Rightly so, though. So yes, I think it ups the pressure. The only thing in these awkward situations is always trying to balance the political pressure and will to get it done, and striking the balance at the right level.
Sandro, tell me, I mean, how do you view it as a policymaker? With the constant, we hear it all the time, the fast-paced change of tech, but also now with the added external impacts of the news of what we see happening in the world around us. And we see users clamoring for some sort of clarity on things like disinformation. How do we deal with that when we talk about user-generated content and, as Seada very rightly says, a prohibition on general monitoring?
Well, I mean, starting from the issue of disinformation, I would say that freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. So it is clear that, I mean, we cannot censure the individual users, but we don't ensuring and respecting the right of each of us to express her or his own opinion doesn't entail the right of each of us to see a very high virality of any content that we put online when this content is clearly linked to a disinformation campaign, a misinformation campaign. When vetted researcher or fact checker are saying this is fake news, this is false. So I mean, this is the point, and this will be the most has been the most difficult point in the negotiation, and it's going to be the most difficult point also, I think, now and in the implementation. And it is linked to what you're referring to. I mean, the issue of moderation, of specific obligation of very large online platform, on the systemic risk to security and to fundamental rights. In my view, that part is probably, from this perspective, the most important part of the DSA. I mean, there are many things that we could say on user protection, user rights. But I mean, to continue to answer to your question, which was directly on that, I would say that the reporting obligations, the transparency obligation, the transparency of the algorithm, the right of the researcher to open the black box and look inside and see how the algorithm works from this perspective of, I mean, having the digital platform on our side to fight disinformation. That is the most important and most sensitive issue in the implementation. But I would say that looking also to the current news is the most important issue. I mean, I was also a member of the Special Inquiry Committee on foreign interference in our democratic processes and disinformation. And it is clear that, I mean, the digital platform and the online activities have played a role in attacking our freedom to making our mind as citizens and voters in a free way. Then, you know, the point is not how many people, because I mean, when I was debating on a specific case of a constituency in a former EU member state, forced past the post system, I think you guess, which was, according to many researchers, clearly a constituency where you had got strong influence by a foreign power. The answer was, yes, but it wasn't decisive to win. Yeah, but this is not the point. This is not the point. And this is why, I mean, the point is, should we ensure that our democratic processes are fully independent and that each of us can make up his or her own mind without being influenced? This is the point. And I think that I don't know how this part, probably you have some idea, I don't know how this part is going to be really implemented. I mean, for the expert Article 26 or 27 of this DSA. But I think that from the perspective you mentioned, this is the most important part. And of course, it's linked to the more transparent obligation that has been introduced.
Asha, I see you nodding along. Would you like to comment on that?
So yes, I think that I'm nodding along and listening to the debate as it's going, and I think that of course we need to address specific issues around such as disinformation. We know that the Digital Services Act is going to try and tackle this in the provisions around Article 26 on the risk mitigation measures and addressing the systemic risk. But you mentioned earlier actually the other mechanisms and the other legislative frameworks that are important here, and we have to remember that we also have the draft proposal on online political advertising, and that also specifically tries to address some of the issues that MEP Gozi has mentioned there. But it is very much about the balancing of fundamental rights in these aspects. It cannot be about the preservation of some rights over and above the others. We have the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, and we have to ensure that all of those rights are preserved. And thinking about this from an intersectional perspective, my background was in looking into online gender-based violence and advocacy around this. And this required a very clear, nuanced approach in which the respect for all fundamental rights and the balancing of those rights was needed, so that mechanisms, whether it was in content moderation practices or whether it was legislative approaches, didn't undermine efforts to actually concretely address the issue and became either laws of unintended consequences or content moderation practices of unintended consequences either. So this is why it has to be centered on that human rights centered approach, and the appropriate safeguards need to be put in place. And though it is vital that we do have the DSA soon, and we want to make sure that we have an appropriate framework for the contemporary digital ecosystem that we operate in, EU decision makers, lead negotiators really need to think deeply and reflect about the practical implementation of these to make sure that the rush to bring this to life does not unintentionally undermine the very rights that they are tasked with and voted for to protect.
Well, let me throw into the mix there as well. We also have the upcoming AI Act, which will muddy the waters even further in relation to things like opening the algorithm, Sandro, as you said. So let me ask then, how do you see the DSA working alongside upcoming laws like the Digital Markets Act, the Data Governance Act, and the AI Act, as well as existing rules around, say, GDPR. Do you see, Siada, let me ask, do you foresee any huge stumbling blocks, or do you think that there's enough consideration given that the legislators working on these may have worked on those other files as well?
So if we pair it back to where the Commission proposal was, I think definitely it would have taken the other pieces into account. Where it is right now, and I think that's the complexity, again, at the very late stage in the negotiations, it's how will it then interact with it? What has been added to the piece that gave it a different form, different way of implementing it, different definitions, and how will that fit into the other pieces? So, for example, just to respond to one of the concerns with regards to disinformation, so there a lot of work is already being done to prepare for the DSA being finalized. But similarly, we've got the CSAM proposal coming up next month. We have got the AI Act that is still to be defined. The political advertising is going to be another one. But they all need to complement one another. And it will become tricky, and it will mean a lot of lawyers reading word for word every clause again to see how that will echo each other, and whether we don't have different definitions. So at a certain point, there was a child protection clause in that turned into a ban on targeted advertising for minors. That was the right adaptation, because then you didn't have a conflict anymore with AVMS or the GDPR. Had it been children, it would have been in direct conflict. So it's those kinds of details that still need to be checked, and will continue to be checked in those that come after the DSA to make sure that there isn't any conflict then.
Joanne, your thoughts as well on this, on the, if you like, interoperability of the DSA with something like the GDPR?
Yeah, thank you. First, let me just, talk about, Russia, because of course, we've seen lots of debate these days with regards to the DSA, or to what extent, we can learn new lessons for the DSA coming from the conflict and the challenges triggered by the conflict in Ukraine. And I would like to stress the fact that, we all hope that this is a conflict that will not last long. This is a very exceptional situation. This is a situation where content that is formally prohibited by international human rights law has been disseminated. So here we're talking about a very exceptional situation. So I don't believe it would be wise now to look into the DSA through the lenses of the current conflict now in Ukraine. It would be even dangerous, because the situation is quite exceptional, I believe, and we all hope that it will not last for long. That's the first caveat that I wanted to express. When it comes to the, let's say, connection, interaction with other laws. In my case, because I'm during a certain period of time, I work as a regulator in the audiovisual media sector, and perhaps my main concern refers to the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, that already contains important provisions when it comes to certain content moderation, let's say, rules that platforms need to follow, and the role of audiovisual regulators in this field. And I think that here, it's also important to understand that in many cases, the digital services regulators will be authorities that already have relevant competences in other fields. So I think it would be very important to make sure that the digital services regulators have not only the proper understanding, but also the resources to, let's say, enforce a type of regulation that is completely different from the kind of regulation that they have had to enforce until a certain point. And here I'm talking not only about audiovisual media services regulators, but also data protection regulators and others that may be called by the DSA to play a certain role in this area. So it's not only about, let's say, how DSA interplays with other relevant norms, EU norms, that I think that this is already an issue, but how we adapt national regulators to the new job, considering that in many cases, and if we listen to ERGA, for example, ERGA says, well, audiovisual regulators are here to enforce the DSA. So regulators coming from another sector can really tackle these tasks without, major issues in terms of legal safety, in terms of proper enforcement, proper understanding, etc. Also taking into account that at the top of the system, we will have the European Commission. The European Commission can have technical capacity, but doesn't have the political independence. And according to international standards, those who take regulators, so to speak, that take relevant decisions that affect speech. And if we look at the DSA, the Commission will take many relevant decisions that affect speech. They have to be independent regulatory bodies, either at the national or the European level. So I think that at the level, it's not an issue or a challenge in terms of legislation, but also in terms of the regulatory bodies that will have to enforce the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. I will come back to that in just a moment. You mentioned there that the Ukraine situation is, of course, an exceptional situation, but I wonder if we're not perpetually in exceptional situations. We had a financial crisis, an ongoing climate crisis, a pandemic, and now a war. It feels it's a perma-crisis scenario we're living through. And that brings me a question from our audience member, William, is asking you, Sandro, I think you've answered a lot of it already, but you stated that the DSA is a good balance between excessive deregulation in the US and excessive control in China. Russia is going the way of China. In view of the misinformation related to the Ukrainian conflict, would you have changed anything in the position of the European Parliament on the DSA?
No, because we didn't take into account the Russian aggression to Ukraine, but we took into account the Russian misinformation action, as we took into account the Chinese misinformation action, as we took into account the interference of Venezuela in the democratic processes. All this is not breaking news. It is in our report that we had adopted with the inquiring committee. So, we know, we did name them. I don't know if they are ashamed. I don't think so. But, we have identified them. And we have already taken into account some of the measures. And I think that, I repeat, the moderation obligation, the obligation to address the systemic risk to security and to fundamental rights, also to cybersecurity, I think that there. And then, as it has been mentioned, there is another piece of legislation which is going to be very important, and I don't say it because I will be the draftsman, but because political advertising online and offline is part of the answer, and is part also of the answer to the question. And there we have to see which kind of new measure in terms of transparency and also in terms of restrictions we want to introduce when it comes to political advertising. What shall we do with non-EU actors? For example, this is a key issue, but it is clear that, and the other aspect, which is going to be addressed in other proposal, for example, NSI and also at national level, is the issue of cybersecurity. Because to complete the answer to the person who is following us, it is clear that there is a war which is going on and we are already fighting, which is the cybersecurity war. And that is going to be more and more in the future, the way of handling conflict. And also this aspect, which goes well beyond the SA, but is something that we have to start to address also at EU level. Strategic compass adopted yesterday go toward the direction, and is part of the answer to our autonomy, our independence, after all.
Well, I hope we'll have a chance to have another debate on those specific issues, because indeed there is a revision of the NIS coming up, coming down the track. We're going to see version 2, which I'm sure will take into account many of these areas. Moving on to back to Jean's comment regarding enforcement and regulating bodies and so on. I do want to ask, what will user redress look like? How do we think that's going to function? And, not all regulators are created equal. We've seen with, again, the GDPR is always my go-to reference point, but the DPAs, they vary from one country to the next. The ones who are well-funded do a great job. Those who are less well-funded, less so. Seara, what's your take on how might user redress be successfully accomplished in a way that's not too burdensome on either the user or the victim of the complainant, if you like?
So I think that this is still an issue that is currently being resolved. So it's not one that's been finalized. But where we hopefully will land is that we'll all have a bit more certainty as to what can be done without it turning into a bottleneck for the regulators. Because I think that that's going to be a big issue. This is a very broad piece of legislation that covers a lot of ground that should allow the DSCs to also be the dialogue partner with the technology industry to really understand where they're going, what they're doing, be the ones overseeing them, but also have more of a hand on the pulse in terms of what's going on. And the last thing we'd like to see is to create bottlenecks that are unnecessary. And I do think what Joanne said is 100% true. It's where will these responsibilities lie? Do we? And I know you said of course we have a transitional period, but will that be sufficient for these DSCs to be functioning in a way that they can cover all the ground that they're supposed to? I think that still has to be seen. I have every faith that they will do it, but when, I don't know yet.
Sandro, what's your perspective on enforcement and on who should those regulatory bodies be?
I mean, on these two issues, one operational and other legal, I will mention few examples. The operational is that, I mean, we have to make sure that the surveillance authority, the regulators, have enough human and financial resources. And this is the key point. I think that, I mean, this is also something that I hope the Commission replied to me several times that we'll take into account, but it's clear that, I mean, both at national level and at European level, you have to put enough resources. Otherwise, you will encounter the same problem that we have encountered at least in the fourth phase of the GDPR implementation, where both because of lack of will and because of lack of resources, the level of implementation in the different member states is pretty imbalanced. And that is exactly what we have to avoid with the Digital Service Act. From this perspective, I mean, we will see what will come out of the negotiation between Parliament and Council, but I mean, the fact that we also insist on enhanced cooperation mechanisms between the authority of the country of origin and the country of destination, with a stronger role also for the Commission, that can help. But both, I repeat, I insist, both here in Brussels and the capital, they have to put more money and more people to ensure that the DSA properly works. And then, I mean, there is a set, I won't go one by one, but a set of rights for the consumers to redress, to be better informed, to appeal, to have a right of appeal, to have also the possibility of being compensated for the damages provoked by the violation of certain aspects of the DSA regulation. I think that all this goes toward the right direction of a more transparent market. And I think that also for the online marketplaces, this is something which goes in their favor, because the more transparency you ensure, the more you let the market develop, because there is more confidence of the consumers. So I think that from this perspective, there are certainly important steps ahead.
I think we're probably going to add to that a need for the different regulators in the different capitals, the different member states, to be joined up and coherent with each other as well, to head off any future forum shopping as it may come to pass. Joanne, let me turn to another element, one which I think is quite interesting about online marketplaces and the know your business customer requirement. Do you think that's something that's a realistic working proposal at the moment?
Well, first of all, one can understand the need to protect customers. and because this is something that politically speaking is very strong, and particularly I think that during the pandemic, many governments, with the increase of, let's say, online markets, people buying or having access to different products online due to the restrictions, of course, I mean that this has grown, and with that, I mean, concerns have grown. But on the other hand, I think that I mean this idea that is laudable of protecting users, I think that in some cases may indeed harm certain business models that rely on certain, indeed, the need to know their customers. And I think that in this case also, I mean, it can be problematic to introduce further restrictions that at the end of the day, I mean, affect provisions that are already included, for example, in the GDPR, creating certain problems in terms of interpretation. So in this sense, I think that the DSA needs to be refined. The first thing. Second, I think that certain obligations, let's say, in terms of protecting legality that now are imposed on platforms, they need to be redistributed, so to speak, in terms of better collaboration between platforms and consumer protection authorities and data protection authorities. Because otherwise, I mean, some harm can be made to, let's say, small actors that really rely on the new online markets to thrive precisely in the digital economy. Also, the notion itself of online markets, I think, needs to be a little bit better defined in the text of the DSA, because the idea of facilitating contracts is still very much open in my view, and they may let's say trigger issues of interpretation, because I mean, in this concept of facilitating, I mean, the contracts or commercial interactions, we can find many different models with different degrees of intervention by intermediaries, and this is probably not sufficiently contemplated with sufficient, let's say, or this is not contemplated with sufficient finesse at this point by the text of the DSA.
Asha, I think you wanted to jump in with a comment.
Yeah, sure. So I don't want it to derail us back on the conversation there, but I thought this question around enforcement was incredibly important because of where we are in the legislative process. We've got the negotiations ongoing. We're moving what seems to be quite swiftly towards the conclusion of the text. And so we have to think about enforcement already, if not yesterday. And so when looking at the enforcement mechanisms put forward and looking at the different mandates, you have the European Parliamentary mandate and the Council's general approach, you can see that the centralized approach proposed by the Council subjectively does try to correct some of the errors or issues that we've seen with enforcement of GDPR. And so I just wanted to reiterate some of the points around the kind of sufficient resourcing when it comes to the enforcement bodies and how existing bodies are supposed to interact with one another and how they're supposed to harmonize their approaches and what they are supposed to be responsible for. But one thing that I thought was very vital to raise here is that the question of enforcement still raises other concerns around the rule of law. And as the mechanisms have been proposed in the draft proposal, but even through the amendments process, some of these concerns still remain. Joan mentioned previously about the independence of the Commission, and this is an excellent point. But I also wanted to talk about, say, the kind of co-regulatory approach of the DSA and some of the voluntary measures that have been foreseen in the to aid in the enforcement of the Digital Services Act, notably the Code of Conduct on illegal hate speech, but other foreseen codes of conduct. And we have to be careful when thinking about this in terms of enforcement and how to use these mechanisms as well to make sure that they don't push content regulation out of the bounds of traditional due process, and to make sure that enforcement is not only workable, but does stand up to the rule of law, which, as we know, has been a very deep and detailed discussion in the European sphere over the last few years.
I'm going to stay with you with a follow-up question that's come from our audience. Aidan has asked us to talk about implementation and regulation, but also asked, how are such measures deemed to be a success? How do we measure success? Do we have any KPIs for this, as it were?
Really important question, and I think given how broad the DSA is going to be, we're going to have to need some very concrete measures of success. But content moderation in itself is an ever-evolving effort that needs to adapt to contemporary challenges, and so therefore we need to make sure that one of the elements that we are looking at is a better handling of user content, and that's kind of through compliance with the clear proportionate obligations that are workable, and the realization of those kind of foreseen due diligence obligations, but making sure that the risk mitigation measures, so the Articles 26 and Articles 27 and what they contribute to, and the assessment of those can clearly see a progression and an improvement of the digital ecosystem and how people are experiencing those, how people are able to access those kind of content moderation mechanisms, those user redress mechanisms, and to see a broader improvement. But then as we go deeper and research is developed and analyses are developed, they will also be able to contribute to us having an analysis and a complete picture of whether the ecosystem and whether measures that are being adopted are working towards an improvement. And this is where topics such as access to data, researchers, and the development of concrete analyses are so important.
Yes, Ed.
Article 26 and 27 are going to be key in this in this whole part of the discussion, because the codes of conduct, if I'm looking at the disinformation space, where we've been working for almost a year on the revision of the code of practice on disinformation, which the Commission hopes will eventually become a code of conduct under the DSA. There are going to be very, very specific KPIs in there. But there's also going to be an oversight group in terms of regulators, in terms of the Digital Media Observatory, the Commission, coming together as a task force to oversee that work. So how will that fit in with the overall enforcement of the DSA through the DSCs? Those are questions that I think we're going to have to tackle when it's actually on the ground. At the moment, we're working in parallel, and going back to your question on how is it going to conflict with some of the work that's being done, I think that that's where we're going to start seeing clashes, not for a will of effort or wanting to create conflict. It's just how will it actually work, but we're not there yet.
Well, it's interesting because Tony Gregory is asking online about existing intersection with existing media law. He says, is the DSA going to bring online content, for example, Netflix, YouTube, into line with broadcasting editorial standards for TV and radio? It is no longer sustainable to have two different editorial regulatory standards.
Well, you have AVMS is already in place. So that's not the role of the DSA. The AVMS is already in place.
Another question, also a little bit on scope from Masood. Is the metaverse taken into account in the DSA regulation or only online platforms, as the metaverse is beyond current social media platforms? I presume we don't really know what the metaverse is yet. What would you say to that?
I don't know. I'm not sure I haven't understood the question, really.
I think he's talking about the virtual reality world, the metaverse. Yes.
I mean, I don't know how much the metaverse would be covered by DSA obligation. I don't know. I really don't know how to answer to this question.
Down to the functionalities, and that there I'm not sure, to be honest. I haven't had insight for firsthand into how metaverse works.
Thank you for the question. You're talking bleeding edge technology there that we really don't have an insight into yet. That's probably a very good point to raise, that we do need to look ahead, and we talked about future proofing. But as yet, I don't think anyone on our panel is in a position to answer that question today. But our audience should still keep sending in questions. You've got a chat box there. We've got a few minutes left. So I'm going to come back, Asha, to a key point that has been raised also, which is what will digital advertising look like? It's a driver. It's the so-called engine, if you like, of a lot of the so-called free internet, but it is problematic for various reasons. What is the DSA going to do to it, or is it going to change it fundamentally?
So I think it's no secret to anybody here on the panel or to those engaged in the discussion that online advertising has been on the highest of points on the political agenda when it comes to the DSA negotiations. And the European Parliament put forward a strong mandate, which includes a prohibition on the use of sensitive data, such as religion, political opinions, or sexual orientation. And this ban on minors in line with Article 9 of GDPR, that first point, and then the ban on minors. So this is a stark variation to the Council's general approach, and Article 24 remains on the agenda for the technical and political discussions. But thereby, we're actually yet to see what the DSA will determine when it comes to digital advertising and what that will look like, because you have these variations between mandates and because the negotiations are still going on. But from our perspective, in an era of behaviorally targeted advertising as a norm, prior efforts to manage the negative impacts of online advertising in this context have proven insufficient. A panelist, MEP Gozi, has mentioned, without naming, my own home state and the issues there that we saw with Cambridge Analytica in 2018, for example. So at the crux of this debate are the impacts on democracy and democratic participation, particularly in regards to, say, micro-targeting and how this has been used historically against marginalized communities in particular. And in fact, the fact that many users are still not fully aware of how certain inferred data about them is being used for these purposes, even in spite of the existing limitations that exist under GDPR, or how the online advertising ecosystem fundamentally works. The very concept of the kind of dominance of the surveillance-based advertising model, it just doesn't simply support a transparent, thriving democracies. And so what we truly hope as civil society is that the current status quo on online advertising and that ecosystem is fundamentally shifted, not only by the provisions in the Digital Services Act, but in the provisions and the enforcement of other mechanisms that we've spoken about today.
Jean, what's your perspective on the digital advertising space as it relates to the DSA?
Well, no, I subscribe what has just been said, because I believe that we need to understand that political advertising, even if it's called advertising, it's political speech and political propaganda, so to speak. So it's a completely different type of content if we compare it to commercial let's say, advertising. So the name, it's basically, I mean, of course, I mean, political advertising also tries to sell something, but I mean, the way, the type of clients, the social function of political advertising, the implications of data collections, are completely different. So I'm totally in favor of, I mean, specific norms that particularly focus on issues related to political advertising. I think that even when it comes to data protection challenges and the know your customer, debate that you were mentioning earlier, I mean, these are two completely different debates here when it comes to political advertising. And here, I mean, the know your customer principle wouldn't apply at all. But there's another issue as well that I think it is relevant, is the fact that all member states have their own specific legislation in this field. And in many cases, we have very much diverging legislation, depending, for example, between countries that are in Northern Europe, countries that are in Southern Europe. Election laws that were drafted perhaps, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And it will be a particular challenge also for national, legislators to adapt to this new reality, and the DSA will force them to adapt. So this is an area that we need to understand, that the national level may also trigger interesting legal and political debates, because it will force states to rethink an area that so far has been pretty much monopolized at the state level. And now, I mean, let's say the European legislation is forcing to rethink some basic principles that were regulated by national legislation, as I said. Thank you.
Sandro, this is very much your field. I mean, would you be rather working from a blank slate, or are you pleased that the DSA is making some inroads in this area?
Well, now let me explain, because it's important. I mean, the DSA is a sort of general horizontal legislation. We set down very general principles in the field of activities online, and we have decided in the Parliament to introduce also specific provisions for advertising, banning targeted advertising for certain categories, looking at sensitive data, okay? And this is for commercial advertising. What John Baratta was referring to, and I fully share his views, is political advertising. And political advertising is going to be regulated in another piece of legislation, another piece of legislation which is devoted to political advertising, and on which we have to ask ourselves, at least in my view, 3 questions to answer to your question. The first is, political advertising is only of political actors, or there are other actors? I think that the answer is other actors as well. And this is, it is the matter of the scope of this regulation, because I think that, I mean, it cannot be decided looking at the actors, but looking at the activity. If the activity is political advertising, on that activity we should apply the rules of political advertising. That's the first point. The second point is Cambridge Analytica has been mentioned by Asha Allen. Should we tackle the risk? Should we try to prevent other Cambridge Analytica in the future? Of course, I think that I do the unanimity here. The answer is yes. Is transparency the only way, and it is transparent in transparency the sufficient way? That for me is an open question. Certainly, we have to introduce stronger transparency requirements. It must be very easy for me as a citizen. When I look at a post, this post is paid by Sandro Gozzi. Sandro Gozzi has paid 100,000 euro to promote this campaign for, I mean, against whatever. I mean, on a political issue. It is must be very clear, very clear. And then, should we, on the model of what we did in the Parliament for commercial advertising, introduce more stringent, more binding requirement for certain technique, targeted advertising, amplification technique, etc. I mean, should we do that? Should we ban? Or should these are the 3 points about which we are working, but they all go toward the direction you mentioned. It is clear that it is it is something which is at the heart of our democracy. More and more, so more and more we make up our mind, or more and more we convince the voters through political advertising, and there are strong, huge differences among the member states. And these are, I mean, it is also from the platform point of view, it is an interest to have more uniform rules, because as a service providers, I need to be able to, I mean, have uniform rules on political advertising everywhere. So, but I suggest that you organize another debate on this. Because
Absolutely.
I need also brilliant ideas on these 3 points.
We have only a few minutes left.
Thank you very much.
And I think there is so much fascinating. We could talk for hours about it. There's also many areas we can look at. Sample size of target groups, whether a particular branded red cap for sale is actually a political advertisement or not. I'm going to ask everyone for a very quick 1-minute wrap up. Asha, I'm going to let you start because I know time is of the essence.
Thank you so much. And yes, we definitely need to have another debate on this. CDT Europe will also be engaging in the legislations that were just being spoken about. But just to have a very quick wrap up on this discussion, and I want to come back to MEP's Gozzi's point that he just made on the fact that the DSA is a general horizontal legislation. And this means it needs to set a foundation. It's a foundational piece, and that must be clear. Legislators need to recognize the leading position that the timeline of the Digital Services Act and the negotiations, and where that has placed the EU in terms of being a leader in this area. There cannot be provisions that could be operationalized by authoritarian governments, for example, thinking about the current political context that we're in. We need to make sure that the provisions that we have stand up to not only EU values, but international human rights values too. The obligations, especially around transparency and due diligence, must be practical, actionable, and proportionate, so that we don't develop a swathe of mechanisms that are ultimately not impactful or unenforceable. They need to make sure that they are upholding individual users' rights online and bolster a diverse ecosystem. And lastly, I would say we've covered a lot of ground, but the ground is huge. And so a multi-stakeholder approach is certainly needed. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that civil society must be at the heart of this discussion with the expertise and objectives that we bring to this. It must be, the DSA must be completed in the true spirit of transparency and democratic participation. And that means from inception to implementation, to enforcement, to assessment, to re-evaluation, civil society must be there to ensure that rights are upheld and that we are part of that conversation.
Thanks, Asha, giving us a lot of work for the future there. Joan, really briefly, if you could sum up in a minute or so what you want our key takeaway to be today.
Yeah, I would like to just to mention two things. First, to reiterate this idea that obligations need to pass the test, if I can put it this way, of necessity, proportionality, and let me add efficacy, if you wish, in terms of the benefiting consumers and legal certainty. The second thing I would like to stress, and by the way of something Siada mentioned, is that I believe that Articles 26 and 27 are key in the DSA. They are key because first are fundamental in order to address certain risks in societies, but they're also key because they may have a very strong impact on the exercise of human rights. And these two elements put them at the very center of the debates that still need to take place as part of the legislative process. I see a lot of, let's say, risk assessment, risk mitigation when it comes to risks for society that are defined in many cases, I mean, in the wording of these articles in a very broad manner, but I'm still missing human rights risk assessments and human rights needs mitigation, risks mitigations to be incorporated into the text of the DSA. So with that idea, I think I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Sayada, it's a tough job to sum up. I know it's been very broad-ranging.
It has, but I think that one thing we definitely got out of it is, with the brief diversion to the political advertising issue, is that the balance was struck correctly by the Commission when they put out a horizontal framework that will be complemented by the verticals where we indeed can have discussions about scope. About, are we talking about the specifics of the content or of the approach, the issue-based advertising, the political advertising? And you can only do that in verticals. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is the setup of having continued dialogue to keep it future-proof, which means risk mitigation. It means continuing to know where the technology is going and making sure that it's incorporated. I'm not sure if that goes down the metaverse question, but maybe. And then again, the enforcement and getting that balance right, because we are embarking on a different way of enforcing and making sure we have the correct resources, the correct interlocutors to work with. It's all going to be good.
Thank you, Sandra. One key thought in our few remaining seconds.
I mean, it is. We're talking about the most important initiative of this parliamentary term. And Europe will be judged also, and especially the European Parliament will be judged also on the quality of the solution that we will find on these issues.
Thank you very much. Thank you indeed to all of our panelists. Thank you to you, the audience, for your questions, especially those tricky ones that we couldn't answer. Do stay with Euractiv online. Follow EA Debates for future debates and policy events that we will have happening both in a hybrid format, here in the room and online. And with that, I wish everyone a great afternoon.